know much of that process, but they believe that there were people here living beyond that time. At that point in time, 8,000 years ago, the island wouldn't even be an island. It was still connected to the land via a land bridge. The water hasn't risen quite high enough, so you could still cross over. And that land bridge was where the Confederation Bridge is today. That is where the distance is the shortest between the two land masses, and the ground is the highest underneath the water. So the shipyards were all across the island. There were two in Charlottetown. The western part of PEI was the largest in the shipbuilding industry. One man single-handedly owned 9 shipyards on the western part of the island, and basically owned the western part of PEI. His name was James Yeo. He's a very, very interesting individual. He came here with nothing, no prospects, 2 daughters he had to feed, and he dies the wealthiest man on PEI. Where am I? And they say Canada. And he says, and writes down, this land is Canada, or Canada. That's the first time the word is used. It did not mean this land. It was just my village. Jacques Cartier asks him, where am I? The chief says, Canada, my village, and he writes that down. That's what Canada means. It can get very muddy, and those wooden planks were not very good. And so they wanted to have a very special sidewalk for this main street. Of course, if you look across, it's different stone over there than it is here. This sidewalk starts across the street on the opposite side and then moves over here for the remainder of this street. Why does it start there and come over? There was an error in the shipment. When the stones arrived, they were 6 feet tall. They were my height, and they were to be cut into slabs. But we did not have tools for cutting stone on the island. So somebody decided to dig a 6-foot trench and bury the stones 6 feet into the ground. They realized that they did not have enough material to cover both sides of the street, so they started down there and then moved over here. So these stones are buried 6 feet into the ground. Eventually the shipment gets changed and they do become the smaller slabs, and it's right about here that we can see the change where they start to crack and break. Overwhelm the Maritimers with all of the small details. Make friendships and relationships first and foremost. Here at the conference in Charlottetown, they agreed on one thing: to have another conference. That was it. But that was considered a big victory. The second conference would take place in Quebec. That would be 1 month later, October 1864. They worked much harder in Quebec. They were not drinking huge amounts of champagne. They were setting to build this country. And from there, the third conference takes place in 1866, and that is in London, England. Queen Victoria is present, her official at this conference. And those 3 ideas for the islanders were seen as negatives. The first, a railroad stretching from sea to shining sea, crossing the entire continent and tying the oceans together. This railroad would be incredibly expensive, and the debt of that railroad would be shared equally amongst all of the provinces. Well, Prince Edward Island was already surrounded by water on all sides. We already made it from sea to shining sea. The railroad would not benefit us on the island, but yet this huge debt would be still paid for by the island. At that time, our own Prince Edward Island dollar, bills and coins, the PEI penny you can still find, and they're very rare if you find a Prince Edward Island penny. They trace back to 1871. They were only minted in that year, and they're very rare. But we had our own currency, which speaks to how well our economy was doing. To have your own economy, your own currency, you had to be able to support it. And the shipbuilding industry was so rich, so huge, that we could afford that. Eventually, this bank collapses, and it collapses with the shipbuilding industry. Eventually, the steamship becomes the more favored method of transportation. 48 years of prohibition. And it very much started through the Catholic Church, this idea of temperance. The bishop would sit up in the very top, looking into the harbor, trying to capture bootleggers, people trying to bring their alcohol onto the island. They would take their big barrels of whiskey and rum, attach huge bricks of salt to them, and throw them into the harbor. The bricks of salt would weigh the barrels down to the bottom of the ocean floor, and there the salt bricks would dissolve and the barrels would float back up. And in the cover of night, they would row out and grab the barrels. The bishop stopped a few of them, but Charlottetown's most prolific and successful bootlegger was a man named Peter P. Gillis, and he was the pharmacist of Charlottetown. He would write prescriptions for alcohol, sell the prescriptions, and sell the alcohol as well. And he built his home right across the street from the bishop. This is the home of the pharmacist, Peter P. Gillis. Quite the statement, building right across the street. Canadians, when they arrived, had nowhere to stay because the circus filled up all of the hotels in Charlottetown. The Canadians would sleep on their steamships in the harbor every single night of the conference. Island hospitality failed. There was nowhere for them to stay. Next door, the Perkins house. Mr. Perkins made boots and shoes, boots very similar to what I'm wearing here. Wellington boots, very good for protecting from the weather and the mud. His boots would be sold to soldiers on both sides of the American Civil War. And Ulysses S. Grant, a famous general from the war, personally ordered boots from Mr. Perkins. He famously asked the man who was restoring the building, why are you doing this? And he said, it's for history. And she said, history me arse, and she spat on him. And for many years, that was a tourism slogan on PEI, was history me arse.